Hi, this is Dr. Morris. I am just wanting to record a brief lecture on backpacks versus briefcases by Laura Bolin Carroll. Some of you have read this last semester for my class and have studied it in some depth. Some of you may have read it for another class, and then some of you may be brand new to it. So this lecture is a refresher for those of you who have already read it, and then it's to give you some quick help if this is the first time you've read it. So I want to go through and hit the high points so that you'll have some tools to use for your case study. So the first thing Carroll talks about is the importance of analysis. She talks about how important it is to do analysis. We're just bombarded with messages all the time, and we need to realize that we're shaped by those messages, and we need to unpack them to see if we want to be shaped in the ways that the creators are trying to get us to be affected. She gives the example of the fact that many women don't consider themselves attractive, and gives a lot of credit to the media for creating that false narrative. So she's emphasizing really the negative impact, and we'll talk about that in a sec. She also wants you to know that you're already doing these kinds of analyses, hence the title Backpacks versus Briefcases. So when your professor walks into the class at the beginning of the semester, you immediately make some judgments about them based on how they're dressed, whether they're male or female, how their hair is cut, what clothes they're wearing, etc. And we do those kinds of snap judgments all the time. And while we kind of stigmatize the fact that we judge people in that way, it's also a survival mechanism. I mean, we have to judge people. It's how we learn how to communicate with each other, how to avoid each other if we need to. So it's an important thing. So she wants you to know, and I want you to know, that in the case of this case study assignment, you've done this sort of thing before. I'm just giving you a new set of terms to use, and asking you to do a little bit more in-depth look at it. So she's particularly looking at rhetoric, and she defines rhetoric as the way we use language and images to persuade. Um, and she talks about the impact that rhetoric has to be a social influencer. So if you think about this, social influence can be both positive and negative. So she talks about the negative thing in terms of women's self-esteem, but social influence can also be very positive. So if we think about the past 2 weeks and all of the messages that we've received about hand washing, how it should be done, how long it should be done, how we are most commonly miss the tips of our fingers and our thumbs and the backs of our hands. So those messages have really been on repeat, and we've heard them and maybe, I hope, internalized them. It's also inspired a series of memes on Twitter and maybe also on Facebook, where people are proposing new songs that you can sing that are about the length of time you need to wash your hands. And so people are choosing popular songs, and um, one of my favorites is whatever song it is that ends up with "My Corona," since it's Corona virus. Ha ha ha. There's also, lots of kids songs, and Bingo is apparently one that works really well. So those can have positive influences as well. So I don't want you to think that it's all negative. She uses Lloyd Bitzer, and I like to use Lloyd Bitzer in my rhetoric classes as well. Lloyd Bitzer wrote an article called The Rhetorical Situation, and he talks about the context of rhetoric, which he calls rhetorical situation. Those two things are interchangeable. And he says there are three parts to the context of rhetoric, or to rhetoric's situation, which is exigence, audience, and constraints. One of the important things to understand about rhetoric is that it's very specific to specific times and places and people, and all of the things that affect a situation. The exigence of a situation is the invitation that we need to participate in the rhetorical action, or to invite people into the act of persuasion. It's the need for persuasion. It tends to be, in fact, it is problem focused. We have this problem, we have this discontinuity, this thing that has happened, and it gives us the purpose for the exigence. So you've probably always been told that you needed to wash your hands for 2 minutes. You probably learned this in kindergarten. I remember singing songs, the ABC song with my daughter as we washed hands. That's one level of exigence, kind of getting kids acquainted with exactly how this goes. But we're in a whole different level of exigence right now, in that washing our hands properly could save lives, in addition to not touching our faces and so on. So if we can feel that need strongly enough, then and understand the problem that exists, then we can clearly understand the purpose of some of the rhetorical advertisements and messages that are being given to us. So exigence is the need, the invitation, the problem, the purpose for a rhetorical event. Secondly is the audience. Audiences come in at least two forms. There's the intended and the unintended. So a lot of things we stumble across, and we're often unintended audiences. The intended audience is the audience that the writer or communicator is setting out to influence. And those different kinds of audiences have a big impact on how effective persuasion can be. If you see an advertisement and you're really confused by it, chances are you're an unintended audience for it. You probably just stumbled into it and you don't understand it because you were not supposed to, because you're not the person intended to be persuaded. It could also mean that the persuader failed in some way, just didn't do what they needed to. In terms of your projects that you're doing later, the audience that you choose should be very specific. Your intended audience, I should say, should be very specific, and they should be able to respond to the problem that you're setting forth. So if the exigence is the need to wash hands, clearly anybody can do this, from a 4-year-old to 120-year-old. So the ability to respond is very, very broad. In more specific sorts of problems, like the vendor being used for the cafeteria and the kind of food that we have, um, while we can talk to each other about that, and we can all have a nice rally about how much the food sucks and all that kind of stuff, what we really need to do is to respond to the committee who makes the choice about the vendor. So the audience is that group of people who should be able to respond to the exigence that you're facing. Third are the constraints, and these are limitations and boundaries. If you look at page 51, you can see the ad council's list of qualifications in order to get an ad listed with the ad council. Those are all constraints. Some things that you need to think about with constraints are, what are the beliefs and attitudes that affect the rhetorical situation? So think, for instance, that the beliefs and attitudes is that, well, I already wash my hands. I wash my hands a lot and I do it well. Chances are, though, you're not washing your hands for 2 minutes, and the belief that you are washing your hands the right way, you need to help someone see that they're not really. And I think if you use the example of songs and how long 2 minutes last, it can have a much bigger impact on helping you understand that and countering that belief that you have. Another constraint might be the medium that you're using. So if you think, for instance, of a message that you want to communicate and you decide you want to take out a billboard, one of the constraints affecting the billboard is that people are passing the billboard at a high rate of speed. So they only have a limited period of time to look at what's on the billboard. So that affects how you should communicate, what you can communicate, what sort of images you should use, and so on. I find sometimes billboards have far too much information. I find it really confusing when billboards have telephone numbers, because it would be really, really dangerous to stop and try to write down that telephone number, which is probably why they have numbers like 555, 5555, so that people can easily remember them. But it is a little bit of a mixed message to have something, that specific. So when you're looking at analysis, you can analyze the exigence that the rhetorical example establishes, whether or not that need or problem or purpose is clear, and whether or not they follow through on it. In terms of the audience, who is the intended audience? Have they chosen a group that can respond? In terms of constraints, what sorts of limitations and boundaries, what sorts of media are being used, and how does the rhetorical situation shape the sort of thing that you're looking at, whether it's a website or a billboard or a meme or whatever. Okay, another set of tools is the rhetorical triangle. This comes from Aristotle originally, and it's logos, pathos, and ethos, and you're probably very familiar with these. Logos is the argument itself. It's that part of the triangle, the argument, and it involves the claims and the evidence that you're making. What kind of argument are you trying to make? I want to say that washing your hands can save your life. So that sort of thesis-driven argument is part of the logos. The pathos connects with the audience. And the role of pathos is to establish in the audience an emotionally receptive place to hear your argument. Often, pathos is a catalyst for action. So, Aristotle says that while logos is the rational reason you should do something, pathos is the stick that gets you into action. Um, Often stories that we tell are those emotional catalysts that get us to act. The third is ethos, and ethos relates to the speaker and the speaker's credibility. It doesn't have to do with ethical, it has to do with credibility. So, what makes you trust the person who's giving you the message? So, for instance, with the Ad Council, that's a fairly austere organization, and you can see they have very strict guidelines. So, that would tend to make us think that they do a good job of screening the messages that come across. If a doctor gives you advice about the coronavirus, you might feel one way as compared to, I don't know, a real estate agent who's writing on the Nextdoor app about what you should do in terms of the coronavirus. So the credibility is really rooted in the person who's delivering the message, and also in the sources that the message is referring to. So referring to the CDC is a pretty powerful sort of source in the time that we're in. One final thing is I encourage you to go to page 55. These are questions that you can ask that will help you do the case study. They can give you some inspiration for how to do the analysis. Well, I hope you have questions, and if you do, please email them to me and we can talk about them further. I hope you're all well. Don't forget to wash your hands. Talk to you later.